Welcome everyone. Welcome to Sit Heads Meditation Club. My name is John. I organize this group. Sit Heads is a sitting and social group for people interested in deep meditation practice. Everything we do is free and donation based. If you want to hang out with us, you can find us at sit-heads.com. There you can get connected with us and join us for all the weird and wonderful things that we do. And now we are very lucky to have with us Allan Cooper. So let me tell you, hopefully without embarrassing him, a little bit about Allan. Allan is a very experienced meditator, largely, I believe, in the Theravadan Buddhist tradition, specifically the Burmese Mahasi influenced tradition, though I think his experience extends beyond that. He's been practicing since 1974. His primary teachers are the legendary 20th century Burmese master Sayadaw U Pandita and his student, the very renowned Sayadaw U Vivekananda. My understanding is that Allan does something like a couple of months or a few months of retreat most years and has been doing that for some decades now. So this is a man with a lot of retreat, a lot of deep practice under his belt, but he is a householder and has managed to carve out a path for deep practice while living the lay life. And that is perhaps why he decided to write a householder's Vinaya, which he describes as an accessible step-by-step how-to manual for anyone wishing to create an everyday life of meditative development. I have read it. It is an interesting, a wonderful, a useful book, and will form the basis for a lot of our conversation here. Allan, I'm going to bring you up with me, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Hey, Allan. Is there anything that you want to say before we get started with our conversation? The way this works is that you and I will have a little chat for maybe 30 minutes, something like that, to help sort of seed the Q&A, give people a sense of what questions they might want to ask, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for the whole group. Before you and I have our conversation, is there anything you want to say before we get started?
I would like to compliment you and Sitheads on the platform and the goals it appears that you guys hold dear to your hearts, which is to establish a community-based sangha, though it might in many cases be virtual. It still establishes a relationship between an active relationship, a way in which we begin to have an accountability to one another. So when you have someone that you're able to practice with for a 3-hour blast or whatever it might be, or even sitting and having a movie, what we do is we establish a community that is so often, especially in the IMS spirit, well, not so much spirit rock, but in the IMS model, we're left to our own devices, and Sangha is secondary to our formal meditation practices. We go to a retreat center and we leave the retreat center. We don't have a lot of relationship with our yogi friends or our yogi colleagues or our teachers. And what you guys are doing is really admirable in very subtle ways. When we are accountable to one another for our virtue and for our integrity, it supports our practice. So what you're doing, John, what you're doing, Sitheads, I think is really, really quite wonderful work.
Thank you, Allan. That really means a lot. I appreciate that so much. And I also really love and value this group and the people in it. It's meant so much for my own practice and for my life. I did forget to mention a few things, which I will mention now. Someone did ask, what's the name of the book? The name of the book is Householder's Vinaya. So Vinaya is a word that is not spelled the way it sounds. It is spelled Vinaya, like Vinaya, but I do believe that the correct pronunciation of the word, which is a word from the old, no longer used Indian language Pali, is Vinaya. A householder's Vinaya. And as you can see in the Zoom chat, his website is householdersvinaya.com. His book, A Householder's Vinaya, is also an act of dana. My understanding is that the royalties are all being donated. Is that correct, Allan?
Yeah, the royalties are being donated to Bhikkhu Bodhi's Global Relief Fund, and I think it deserves also to be mentioned that the book can be downloaded for free for Dana
Yes.
at
Yes.
the website, as well as there is an automatic link if you want to purchase a paperback or an ebook. So the variety of ways of accessing the householder's Vinaya with home and Sangha retreat guides, which is the full name of the book, is available to us all for Dana and or for purchase.
That's a wonderful thing. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. Available completely for free, just given as an offering. And when the book is purchased, the proceeds also given as an offering.
Yes.
So a pure act of dana. Um, what can I say? That rules. Um, I also wanted to post in the chat 3 books that Allan has asked me to share as recommended books from Allan. One of them is, perhaps unsurprisingly, A Householder's Vinaya with Home and Sangha Retreat Guides by one Allan Cooper. The other 2 are by other authors. I haven't read The Noble Eightfold Path by Bhikkhu Bodhi. I hear it's great. I haven't read The Heart of Buddhist Meditation, but I have read Nyanaponika's writing, and he was an extraordinary teacher. And I've heard that The Heart of Buddhist Meditation is sort of his masterpiece. So I'll certainly be taking a look. All right, shall we dive in, Allan? What do you think?
It's good time.
All right, let's do it. So, a word, another Pali word, since we seem to be indulging ourselves in the Pali language tonight, that I read over and over again in your book is Sampajanna, which I hope I'm pronouncing more or less correctly. Now, this I understand is often translated as clear comprehension. So, if you read the Buddha's text on the foundations of mindfulness, whenever he's saying, do this with mindfulness and clear comprehension, do that with mindfulness and clear comprehension, go forward, go back, eat the food, sit down with mindfulness and clear comprehension, that's Sampajanna, correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay. And so my sense from the book is that rather than sati or mindfulness, which is a sort of, you might say, a more non-conceptual faculty, the Sampajanna, as you use it in the book, seems to be a reflective faculty that seems to use thought very deliberately. Can you talk a little bit about what Sampajanna is, especially in the framework of a householder's Vinaya, why it's so important for a householder in particular? And then maybe we can go from there on exactly how does one practice it.
Well, you've touched on the core, the salient point of the entire book. And Sampajanna is, as you pointed out, is
I
called
came
clear
close.
comprehension. Beg your pardon?
I came close.
No, do you? No, oh, in terms of pronunciation,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. I have not yet met an authority with an accent that probably reflects what it sounded like 2,600 years ago. So
Yeah,
we're all
no native Pali speakers to check with.
we're all good.
Okay.
The issue, or what occurred for me, having done so very many fairly long retreats over the years, was the sort of disconnect between formal teachings on retreat and what was available to us from those teachings, those incredibly sublime teachings that we receive on retreat, into everyday life. And one of the things that I began to discover after having read the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutta, is that the Buddha so frequently encourages us to use this thing called Sampajanna, this clear comprehension, and his instructions are very thin. They're to know that you're walking forward, to know that you're walking backward, to lifting your arms and whatnot. But he mentions it so frequently that it invited questions on my part in terms of how this instruction reflected in everyday life. I understood that it wasn't as important to emphasize Sampajanna on a formal meditation retreat, when mindfulness is being instructed, sati, the rendering of our experience to its most very elemental form, and we can walk and know the sensations of hard and soft and heat and cold and whatnot. But what is it like when you're buying tomatoes in the supermarket? There was something that was missing. And what I began to understand is that for the purpose of the development of sati, retreat practice is an amazing opportunity. Formal meditation practice and retreat practice are amazing opportunities, a laboratory to look at the mind from an entirely new perspective. But yet, in everyday life, there is this necessity to also have a reflective tool. What are we doing? How are we living? And so Sampajanna then became an investigative, goal of my own to figure out what the Buddha meant by Sampajanna. And it turns out that in the commentaries, in some centuries later, the commentaries began to refine and define what Sampajanna really meant. And more or less, it's reflected, in my opinion, by the admonishment that the Buddha gives to his son Rahula when he says in, I think it's Majjhima Nikaya 61, and I'll paraphrase, that Rahula, before, during, and after any thought, speech, or action, reflect thus: what you do, is it for the benefit of self, others, or both? Is it not for the benefit of self, others, or both? And this particular admonishment of the Buddha to Rahula encapsulates the more detailed, the more more esoteric descriptions of the four categories of reflection. But reflection becomes the critical tool that helps to mature the sati that we learn in everyday life. On retreat. So Sampajanna is in fact what Sitheads does. It creates a wholesome environment where we begin to examine our purpose and our suitability and our domain and the reality of our experiences through the filter of the rendered wisdom that sati provides us. We don't get that instruction from our retreat and our formal teachers. Generally, at the end of a retreat, we get the instructions when a yogi asks the teacher, "What can I do in order to be able to deepen my practice?" And the answer generally is, "Sit more often, be more mindful."
Yep, be as mindful as possible.
Be mindful as possible. Well, mindfulness isn't necessarily the word that would encompass what the Buddha was saying to Rahula. He's saying reflect. And reflection is also an incredibly important tool in the mix, in the alchemy of moving the subtlety and the beauty of understanding the wisdom of sati into our everyday virtue and our everyday concentration.
Okay, so I want to poke at this a little bit though, because so one could hear this, and I don't think that this is at all what's intended, and so I think by poking at it, we can sort of knock down this straw man and reveal the that some people might mistakenly look at. One could hear this and think of Sampajanna. So I'm going to say clear comprehension.
Sure.
One could think of clear comprehension based on the way you're describing it as almost like a best available practice, a second-rate practice. I know that's not the case. I'm lobbing a softball at you, but the idea that it's like, well, you can't do that good stuff because you're not on retreat. So here's your fallback practice.
Oh my goodness.
So hit me. What you got?
Well, what I got is just our human experience, our human reality, and also to reflect just a moment on in the Eightfold Path. The Buddha so wisely identifies right livelihood as one of the critical and interdependent features of what he considers the path to liberation. And the highest form of livelihood within this framework is what? It's becoming a monastic.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the monastic, in the case of the 227 practice rules for the male and 311 for the female, for fully ordained bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, these are awarenesses that we aren't on retreat doing mindfulness all the time, and these quote rules, or these prescriptions on how to live, are ways in which automatically give the monastic an environment where reflection is already part of their environment.
Mm-hmm.
The same kind of integrated reflective restraint and virtue and routine that is offered and prescribed for the monastic is not available in any of the teachings in the same kind of form for lay people.
Yeah.
So if we just look at the right livelihood, we are obliged to reflect on what is right livelihood and how to engage and navigate through that. So to compare, which is unfortunately how our minds most often work, we will compare reflection to sati, or sati to samatha, to concentration. I think it's a real error, a real normal and very difficult problem if we allow ourselves to look at these practices as separate rather than as integrated parts of a whole, like different facets on a cut diamond. Each facet, when the light goes into the stone, will reflect out of another facet. They are independent, they are codependent, and they work together. So reflection is not a lesser practice, but it is the practice that will help integrate the deeper understandings that might come from sati.
Yep. That makes perfect sense, right? It doesn't make sense. You have to have them both, right? So what's the point of creating a hierarchy among them? That makes absolute sense.
And as a matter, and to further that discussion, that argument, Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, he and Daniel Goleman wrote that, I thought, very telling, very important book, Altered Traits. And what they talk about in that particular book is they don't say it specifically, but they implicitly dance around it, or unconsciously dance around the notion that the more we orient our minds towards the Eightfold Noble Path, in whatever skills, with whatever tools we have, what we do is we are integrating a whole in which allows the neural pathways to be reconditioned in ways that allow for the wisdom to become spontaneous, rather than looking at it as trait, these altered states that arise as the goal. They're not the goal. The goals, these manifestations of deep concentration and deep wisdom are only markers that, when integrated and massaged into everyday life, we become increasingly less reactive, we become increasingly more compassionate, and our wisdom manifests in manifold ways spontaneously, because the continuity of our intention towards the Eightfold Path is cemented by our intention. Again, right intention. It's another aspect of the Noble Eightfold Path.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that word continuity, I want to pick that up, because I know that on formal retreat, for instance, if you are practicing in the tradition following Mahasi Sayadaw and his successors, a lot of hay is made of continuity. It's considered essentially the most important thing, right? To keep your continuity of mindfulness, never let it drop, do not let it lapse, and that's considered like the pressure that builds up in the tea kettle, right? You don't open the oven door to check on it too often, or you're gonna let the heat out. It's like you have to keep that continuous mindfulness to build up that brings you to insight, liberation. Take your pick. Um, how important is continuity in householder life, and what is it continuity of?
It's as important in everyday life as it is in formal retreat practice or formal, or just your daily formal, sit, whatever it might be.
Hmm.
Again, the difference, however, is the tools we use.
Okay.
The continuity, I think it's in the Satipatthana Sutta again, where the Buddha tells us that if we do 3 months or 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks of continuous practice, one of this or one of either you'll be anagami or you'll be an arahant.
Doesn't he get to like 7 days or something like that?
Yeah, he does.
Okay.
I think that's where he stops. It's
Is there
7
a
days.
hotline I can call with my complaint about that? Because it has been more than 7 days, and I'm still.
Well, there's the possibility that maybe your mindfulness and your continuity towards your practicing the Eightfold Path might have weakened at
Oh,
some moment.
I see. It's my fault. It's my fault. Okay.
Well, I don't know about fault. There is no fault. There's the Eightfold Path, and it's an impersonal exercise. But getting to
Don't be distracted by my japes. Let's stick with continuity.
the and here we again had that issue that I was referring to earlier, a few minutes ago, about being on formal retreat for 3-4 months and then coming back to everyday life and going into my career or my relationships or whatever it might be, and recognizing that the tools of sati, the way that I had honed them on formal retreat, were not necessarily suited for the kinds of activities that were going on in everyday life. So the word continuity then becomes a much more variable type of practice, rather than to simply look at it as mindfulness. Yeah. Because we get a particular prejudice about what mindfulness means to each of us individually, and it is actually skewed by the environment in which we are learning it. When he talks about mindfulness and clear comprehension, mindfulness and clear comprehension, and he repeats it, I think something like 19 times in the Satipatthana Sutta, and to also put it into a perspective that he came out of a concentration tradition. Yeah. He was before he became the Buddha, his education, his spiritual teachings were to have studied the jhanas, and he had studied the jhanas and had, quote, mastered them, unquote, according to the history, the legend, the way that people understand the Buddha's life.
And for anyone who doesn't know, who might be watching this now or in the future, jhana refers to very deep absorptive concentration states.
Yes, which might, if we have time or a moment to describe them or discuss them, might be valuable. But what in terms of this term continuity, again, he came from a tradition where his concentration was so well developed that in this particular sutta that we emphasize, and there are other suttas that are arguably as important in terms of the meditation instruction, such as the Mahasi Sutta or the Anapana Sutta. These both then include samatha or concentration as one of the elements of practice. So here we have in our discussion this evening 3 different types of meditation, and the instruction that we more or less receive from the Burmese influence meditation teachers that many of us practice with is be as mindful as you possibly can. Well, there are other ways in which we can apply the Eightfold Noble Path. And one of them is reflection. And reflection in everyday life is the water that makes the flour come together to bake the bread of continuity. We have to have reflection. Reflection is the bedrock of the three virtue aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path: right speech, right action, and right livelihood. If we don't reflect on these qualities, sati doesn't do it. We can't use sati and apply it directly to right speech, right action, and right livelihood if our wisdom is not yet completely fully enlightened. So intrinsically, the Eightfold Path requires us to reflect. And in Householder's Vinaya, it is an experiment. It's an invitation for people to begin to look at their lives so that they are able to establish continuity in their everyday lives using the tool of reflection, and also because it is a manual to create home retreat environments and Sangha retreat environments, similar to what you guys do at Sitheads. It offers us the flexibility to massage both reflection and sati in an integrated way so as to establish a greater continuity towards the commitment of our practice to the cultivation of the Noble Eightfold Path.
Yeah. And that continuity, even though it's more flexible in terms of what it consists of than it is on retreat, is much harder to maintain, wouldn't you say, off retreat, right? I feel like continuity of sati on retreat is child's play compared to continuity. I'm not saying it's child's play, period. I'm saying it's child's play compared to trying to maintain continuity of mindfulness and clear comprehension, continuity of wholesome intention in everyday life. Maybe that's just me.
I would say, well, yes, again, I think because of how we are trained in these particular traditions, we have a tendency of seeing things through that filter. And I would say that each of these practices have their bars, and depending on our character, some people will find reflection easier than sati, and some people will find samatha more accessible than sati. So depending on who we are in the context of our environments, each one of them are extraordinarily difficult in order to realize the depth of their profundity, but all of them are accessible to the level of the wisdom that we have at a particular moment. We can always incline our mind. And I think inclining our minds is one of the more important qualities of reflection. Reflection isn't our thinking necessarily about the Eightfold Path, but there is a way in which we can commit our lives in a visceral way where we incline our minds towards right understanding and right intention and right speech, etc. There is a way of inclining our minds to become more wholesome and more concentrated and more accountable to ourselves and others.
Let's get brass tacks about what that looks like before we open it up to Q&A. So there was, I think, maybe one of the better illustrations of this sort of balance and of mindfulness and clear comprehension that you prescribe in the book is a section in the book where you talk about what you refer to as moving focus in and out. And it seems to me, I'm not sure I completely understand it, but you seem to be describing a sort of practice of flowing, sometimes quickly, sometimes not, but sort of smoothly as called for, between the sort of bare attention of mindfulness and the reflectiveness of clear comprehension. Could you give an example of some everyday activity where it might make sense to use this moving in and out approach and sort of maybe even almost narrate to us what that would actually look like as a practical matter?
Hmm. Um, that can also be done in formal practice as well, looking at a rendered experience and watching through the aggregates how the mind will then perceive. There'll be feeling and perception and mental objects, construction. So you can look at it in terms of a rendered experience, and then you can also look at it as a concept. So you can go from concept to a simply sensory experience. Now that's in terms of sati through the aggregates. I think what you're looking for is well, there are a variety of ways. I don't know if it's an interesting question, but one that pops to my mind and has always had me behind sort of an eight ball is that I have a fairly large garden, and I keep a compost heap. And for those of us who have compost heaps, or those of us who know what a compost heap is that it's a living organism, and in it are a bunch of worms and a bunch of grubs and whatnot, and you're throwing food into it or nutrients into it and water into it, and it's got to be turned in order for the soil and all of the organic matter to decompose. And when one turns the soil, one is killing worms and killing grubs and killing what we call box bugs here. And to be able to periodically, while doing the exercise of turning the compost heap, watching the body do what it's doing, watching perhaps the visceral reaction, the unwholesome visceral reaction to the of the killing, and then step back and watch that visceral that activity through the filter of sati or through the filter of right action, and to be able to constantly balance my place as a human being in the ecosystem of having a garden. So there's a way of a way of allowing the mind to go into the activity, whether it just be the physical feeling of the spade, or the visual experience of the intention of turning the soil and killing these worms, and then watching one's own reaction without judgment as much as possible, simply to observe the experience so that the experience isn't shined on, so that I am paying attention despite its ambivalence and its mixed karma. At least in the experience, the mind is going in and it's coming out using sati and sampajanna. Maybe that hopefully that served your request.
Oh, certainly. Very helpful. Very, very helpful. And if you want more examples, get the book, where there are others. For more like this, visit householderswinaya.com. All right, so I've taken up enough time. I think we should open up the floor to Q&A. Is that okay with you, Allan?
Yeah, certainly, sure.
Great.
I'd love to meet your friends.
All right, and some of yours too, I think, and hopefully soon to be our shared friends. And I'll just throw out there. I had one more question that I'm not going to ask, but it's essentially about how do we practice mindfulness and clear comprehension in the way the book suggests when you live and work in a largely digital environment where these attention hijacking platforms, systems, and devices can't be avoided because they're even part of your livelihood and your way of communicating with your loved ones and so forth. So I'm not going to ask you that question. If someone finds that to be an interesting question, steal it and ask it. I'm just putting it out there.
Please.
Because I'm curious. Simon has a question for Allan. Simon, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Yes. Thanks for hosting this, John. Thanks for coming, Allan. My question is about Mahasi style noting in daily life. I've done a little bit of Mahasi style practice and found it really helpful for my mind, and do it in my formal sitting as much as I'm able. And just, it's not clear to me how that translates to lay life.
For those of you who are unaware of what the question means, in the Mahasi technique, to highlight and to support mindfulness meditation, the Mahasi system encourages a light, a silent mental note to basically shine a light on the experience, so that it helps with the concentration, it helps with the attention towards the knowing of the experience in an intuitive, non-conceptual way. So the question is how and is, or what role does noting play in everyday life? And I think it's important to, from my point of view, and now again, I may be unorthodox in this regard, but once noting is an established tool in a person's meditative bag of tricks, it's not necessary to use it in everyday life. It actually gets in the way. Periodically, if you're as enculturated as I am, as an example, it's unavoidable that mental noting will arise periodically. But it's happening not as even a 5% element of the mental activity. It's happening like at a 1% level. Noting in everyday life, I think, might be better served if we begin to start exercising reflection, and to examine what the Eightfold Path is in terms of how we approach and how we integrate that understanding of what is an impersonal, impermanent experience into our everyday lives. So I actually, personally, I don't believe that noting is a valuable or useful tool for the most part in everyday life.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. I hope I haven't stepped on any toes.
Well, thanks, Simon, and thank you, Allan. Let's see. Fred, would you like to ask your question?
Actually, my question was your question, so you can go ahead.
Wow. No, Fred, okay. Do you want to come up and ask your take on it, or do you just want Allan to let her rip?
No, I thought it was a great question. I just wanted to hear the answer.
All right. Well, thanks, Fred. Well, then I'm going to pull myself back up. It's just that way Allan doesn't just have to look at like an eerie blank screen of like just himself. You know, he has someone he could speak to. All right, Allan.
My internal conversation goes on continuously like everybody else's. So a picture of myself would be kind of cute, actually.
No, fair enough. Fair enough. But we have another question behind this. But yeah, when your job, it's like I come back from retreat, and I always tell myself it's gonna be different this time. You know, the computer, it's a distraction machine. My phone, it's a demon, you know, and I know it. I'm not gonna go there. But I can't not go there because that's how I talk to my mom, you know, and I can't not be on the computer because that's how I do my work. And so it's like you're trying to develop healthy eating habits, and you have a job as a jelly bean taster or something. You know,
no, I understand.
So what are your suggestions there? And this is a relatively new problem, I think. At least to this magnitude, maybe.
Well, yes and no. I mean, we personalize our own stories in various ways, and it's natural. It's what we know, and those things that seem to have a negative impact or an unwholesome impact on our consciousness, we tend to blame the context rather than we blame the messenger rather than the situation. And I'm reminded immediately of the barriers that would have been, or is still extant in many cultures, of, let's say, the relationship between family members. Here in the West, our families are important to us, are very valuable and very important, but the relationship between our families in the West, or in post-industrial societies for the most part, we have an individuated relationship with our families. Whereas at the time of the Buddha, and very often in more agrarian societies, people are integrated with their family in a profoundly interdependent way, which makes their experience from going to a retreat and then coming home maybe very similar to the same kind of barriers that you're describing about computers. It's our relationship to our environment and the context of our environment that becomes very valuable, and not to be not to blame the family for our inability to go on retreat, or blame the computer for the break in our continuity. We, in whatever we do, under whatever conditions we have, whether it's in a palace or a concentration camp, whether it's using computers or the embrace of a family, all of it will have various kinds of hooks and barriers that we will then blame for our inability to sustain continuity. It isn't the machines, it's our relationship to them. So my suggestion, because we're looking at it from a practice orientation, is that greater reflection, or perhaps taking 2 minutes on every hour, or touch, putting your hand on the desk and feeling cold, or asking yourself, is this a benefit for self, others, or both? There are varieties of ways in which we can integrate within that hour various inclinations of the mind to practice deeper ways of discovering the freedom of the Eightfold Path. So it isn't our livelihoods per se, it's our relationship to them. Sorry.
No, that was some tough love, Allan. I appreciate it. Okay, fair enough. All right. Thanks. I'm glad we got to get to that. Chappelle, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Hey, Allan. Thanks for coming by. I really appreciate your book. My question is kind of around Vedana, or feeling tone, and I wanted to ask you, how do you recommend one uses Vedana or a feeling tone to develop a non-self-referencing point of view, or like develop like a non-self view, to the extent that it actually becomes like a permanent shift in the way that we see the world?
Well, thank you for asking that question. It's one of my favorite sweet spots. As dependent origination, I just take a little bit out of it. And dependent origination is this notion that the Buddha offered to us to understand how things happen, how things begin and how things end. And part of that process is, there are varieties of ways of looking at dependent origination, but part of it, and the one part that I think is what you're asking about, is that whenever the mind takes an object through seeing or hearing, smelling, tasting, sensations, or thoughts, what happens in the mind is that there is a concomitant feeling tone, what's called Vedana, which you mentioned, of either a pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant or non-pleasant feeling tone, an actual feeling tone of something pleasant or unpleasant, or that which can create confusion. And in the natural flow of our minds, what happens is that when pleasantness arises and it's not observed, if pleasantness is not observed, what happens immediately is an I arises, and I like the pleasantness. And then after I like, if that's not noticed, I want. And if I want isn't noticed, then what happens is I cling, I want to hold on. And the reverse is true too with the unpleasant. Unpleasantness arises, not liking, not wanting, pushing away. And if it's neither pleasant nor unpleasant, what happens is the mind grows confused and is looking for something that's pleasant or unpleasant. So in our meditation, our formal meditation practice, it's possible by using what the Buddha described as the aggregates. We are able to look at our experience in terms of a feeling, a physical experience, whether it's sight or sound or whatever it might be, and its concomitant pleasantness or unpleasantness. The more often we are able to understand that pleasantness leads to, intuitively understand, not thinking it, but knowing and watching pleasantness lead to liking, wanting, clinging, the more we're able to disengage, step out of that cycle of just being habituated into wanting to hold on to what we think is what we like. And so your question deals directly at that place in practice, which will allow the mind to become non-reactive. And if done frequently enough, it becomes an intuitive baseline for the way in which we behave in the world. Again, talking about Davidson's work in terms of altered traits. We go on retreat or we use reflection over and over and over again, and we become de-identified with this process, and in consequence, pleasantness arises, that's fine, no reaction. Unpleasantness arises, no reaction. When the mind is non-reactive to pleasantness and unpleasantness, an amazing transformation can occur. When that state of mind happens on a more continuous basis, things like the Brahma Viharas, which is loving kindness and compassion and sympathetic joy and equanimity, begin to become the baselines of our experience. They happen spontaneously. So what you're asking about, we use the wisdom where we are. And if we can recognize this pleasantness to clinging or unpleasantness to pushing away, this will incrementally, like sands on a beach, create a sand dune, the Sahara. But grain by grain by grain, every pleasantness noticed that it doesn't lead to liking, to wanting, to clinging, is the way that eventually allows for the mind to liberate itself. Was that what you were looking for?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allan. Thank you, Chappelle. Let's see. Ruth, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, please. Alan, I'm absolutely delighted because what you're talking about is so much more what I started with and still love in practice, and my first teacher was Larry Rosenberg.
Yeah.
And he came from Zen to mostly Theravada, but not Burmese. So my question is, I love the more open, whatever happens, pay attention to it and reflect on the teachings style that you're talking about. What advantage do you feel is there to the very structured, very, well, the Zen people would say, and the Tibetans, dualistic kind of retreat format that the Burmese teachers teach? Is there something that's super about that, or is it just an option?
I'm not really clear. When people begin to talk about dual and non-dual,
Don't take the dual that much. That's
U Pandita used to have this this rather motivating and very annoying habit of saying, "Did you note it?"
right.
So one of the things that I've long time ago discovered, at least for my own practice, is that if something is speculative, it really doesn't serve the practical application of my wisdom. It actually reinforces old patterns of being able to be really smart and clever and come up with great ideas. I don't know about dual and non-dual. I do know about pleasantness, liking, wanting, clinging. I can experience that. I know that to be a fact. And I also know as a fact of when the mind becomes increasingly less reactive, there are states of mind that various traditions will argue about what that is.
Mhm.
but the bottom line is that the mind becomes non-reactive and has greater accessibility to deeper non-reactive wisdom and integrated compassion with others. That's enough for me. The rest of it, I'm happy that scholars like to write books about it and spiritual people like to read books about it. But as far as the practical application of liberating this mind in this lifetime, speculation doesn't, I don't believe that speculation is more important than anything other that deserves our observation of looking at it through the filter of impermanence, non-self, and suffering.
I totally agree, and I wasn't asking about speculation. What I
Okay.
said was, given that the description that you're talking about for the householder and householder practice is more, an U Pandita retreat is further from that than, say, a Larry Rosenberg retreat.
Okay.
Much
Yeah.
or a Joseph Goldstein retreat.
Right.
How do you feel about, whose retreat what kind of retreat practice is particularly advantageous, or doesn't it matter?
It's that's really hard to say, and it's hard to know in context of timing and what's appropriate at a particular time. The integrity that one brings into a retreat environment, I think is really important. And also, just as a side note, some years ago, when I decided that I would sit with this teacher or that teacher I made a commitment at one point, and I said, I will do what this teacher says. I'll do what this teacher says, because at the end of this retreat, whether it's a 9-day retreat or a 60-day retreat, whatever it might be, I can do what I want. But for these 60 days or these 9 days, I will do what this teacher instructs. That said, it's valuable to know what you're getting into. And so long as the teacher and the environment is a wholesome environment and relies on the Noble Eightfold Path, there can be ways in which we exercise various tones of our meditation practice that wouldn't get exercised if we only stayed with one teacher all the time. So the emphasis from one teacher to another is fine. And like Joseph said, and John had Joseph on not so long ago, and I think he summed it up is, so long as the practice teaches non-clinging, non-clinging. So be fair, be honest, allow yourself to exercise various areas that might even feel uncomfortable. But by staying in one rut all the time, with one practice all the time, we might not be observing a clinging to a certain kind of pleasantness of the familiarity of that practice. So I do encourage practicing with other teachers with an open heart, and recognize that it may feel uncomfortable, but it may serve the overall practice in profound ways.
Thank you. Incidentally, when U Pandita came to IMS in '93, I went there as a work retreatant because IMS asked me to. And they needed work retreatants because U Pandita's style of retreat was so constrained that the regular retreatants weren't
no work,
no work.
No yogi jobs. Please, rather than comparing, if the teacher and the system is a wholesome one that will help incline the mind towards the Eightfold Path, doing things slightly differently can be very useful, especially for the cultivation of sati.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Allan. Chappelle, do you want to ask another question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm not sure if I can ask this in a way that makes sense, but
Give it a go.
cool. Yeah, in terms of like metta on the path, would you say that, I know it's metta is like obviously wholesome, but couldn't it in the way you described the answer to my last question in terms of like facing the Vedanas, you know, kind of like as they are, partly my strategy in daily life has to apply metta to like situations and people and objects even, and that inclines the mind to like positivity, but I feel like I might be missing out on staying within the discomfort, the unpleasantness of the situation, and like withdrawing reactivity in like a different way, I guess. That's like, I don't know, more honest.
Well, the question again, it's a juggling act, but the Buddha details as right effort in a very simple fashion. He says to prevent the unwholesome from arising, to remove the unwholesome when it has arisen, to cultivate the unarisen wholesome, and to sustain and maintain and deepen the wholesome. And that will be dependent. Right effort will then be dependent. Well, right effort, then this is towards the intention of the liberation of the mind. So depending on the level of our wisdom in the context of this particular situation, and depending if we're dealing with a latent issue or a conscious issue or a transgressive issue that might be arising, I think it's very valuable to be forgiving and compassionate to wherever our wisdom might be. There are also various tools that we can use to prevent the unarisen, unwholesome, etc. We can bring mindfulness. We can supplant it with like you do, or you're questioning about bringing metta into a situation where there's discomfort or there's tension or conflict or whatever it might be. We do the best we can. One of the greatest linking wholesome mental factors that we can begin to operate and integrate into our lives is forgiveness in the context of patience. So if metta happens to be the tool that you're working on, work with it. It's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. And you'll find that that's not going to be the only way you're going to relate to an experience, and that you're going to discover that the way you're using metta is going to morph into a different, deeper understanding of what metta is. And at times you'll drop the metta and you'll use sati, or you'll use karuna, or you'll use mudita. We have a tendency of looking at our experiences and identifying them and setting them in concrete and thinking that they are the only way we're doing things. It'll change. It will change. And we use our wisdom where we are. And if we embrace the simplicity of right effort and integrate it with a patient forgiveness for our limited wisdom, we are inclining our mind towards the liberation of the mind from reactivity.
Sweet, thank you.
Nice question, thank you.
All right, thank you, Chappelle, and thank you, Allan. Ganesh, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Hello. Hey, Allan. Thank you for coming by. I've enjoyed the conversation so far. My question was around how right view can inform clear comprehension.
Well, I understand right view at well, I understand the Noble Eightfold Path on two levels. There's the Eightfold Path, and then there's the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is a sort of like a forerunner to the Noble Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path are ways in which we can apply ourselves to our daily lives in more functional sort of ways. So, like when we look at right view, we look at it in terms of karma, which is what the classic first understanding of right view is to understand cause and effect. But the ultimate or the right view is to examine the Eightfold Path as a liberative path to enlightenment. So if we understand that until we are fully liberated, and we begin to understand that that cause and effect really does have an impact on our lives, it inspires us to look at our virtue, our speech, action, and livelihoods in ways that it begins to create an environment that allows for a deeper understanding, a deeper appreciation of the profundity of the Eightfold Path. And that's when we then commit ourselves to the Eightfold Path to liberate the mind. So in both in terms of right view, until we're fully liberated, we're not going to understand the Eightfold Path completely. So it is always, especially in everyday life, the notion of right view is integrated and is part and parcel to how we operate with right speech, right action, and right livelihood.
Okay, thank you. That helped.
Thank you.
Thanks, Avinash. Thanks, Alan. Eve, want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Alan, for being here. And I hope this question is okay. Maybe and we'll see if it's okay to ask this question. But I really love where you got to in terms of like what you're like, okay, is this something that's benefiting me, someone else, or both? Is it, am I being this kind of person that I would like to be? Like, I just feel like I really appreciate, and then, where you got to and how you're getting there with the way you're treating everyday life. And that really speaks to me a lot. But what I'm curious about is was there something that wasn't going right for in your process where you felt like you needed to look deeper into the text and find a different perspective that would give you something that was missing? Because sometimes I wonder, like, those kind of questions, like knowing whether I'm not doing enough of this or should do more of that. Or so I was wondering if there was like a signal for you where you realized you had to look deeper, and then when you found that thing, you're like, oh, okay, this is what I needed.
I have two things I'd like to offer. The simple answer is yes, and more or less our discussion has been about how being on retreat and practicing sati in that very formalistic, very laboratory kind of environment proved to me that in everyday life there was something that could be added to this wisdom, this base of wisdom that would help integrate it into everyday life. So there was a huge missing piece that took me many years for me to become aware of. But that said, I also remember really early in my practice, I began to look at myself in terms of being confined by my sight and my sound, my hearing and my smelling and whatnot, and having to eat and having to sleep and having to defecate and all of these things that are, of being a human being. And so I got, I was energetic and I was a little crazy, but I made a list, and I think I even addressed this in the book. Some of the things I wrote in the book, I don't remember, but it's helpful to begin to examine our bodies and our DNA of socialization from a perspective of impersonal involvement. and how we can begin to look at the various areas of our lives. Am I paying attention when I exercise? Am I paying attention when I'm eating? Am I paying attention? There are so many areas of our lives that we habitually and are genetically engineered that we must do. We must, thoughts arise, whether they're sexual thoughts or boredom thoughts or whatever they might be. We are confined by a certain parameter of being human. And by looking at our experience of what it is that we do in a 24-hour period, whether it's scratching an itch or having to go to the grocery store or smelling gasoline, whatever it might be, there's a billion different things that we can look at our lives and begin to examine them from the perspective of, can I bring greater attention to this experience? Can I change my relationship to this experience? It's sort of like, for those of us who have been addicted to, chemicals or alcohol or whatever, there is an opportunity to look at all of our experiences through this filter of that we are addicts to our DNA. And that if we begin to step back and look at our behaviors, the context of how we relate to our environment, we're going to see more and more places where we're not paying attention, where we could pay attention, and different ways of bringing that attention in creative, non-should, non-stressful, we're able to pay better attention. So the investigation itself will turn up those areas that we haven't paid attention to. But we have to look. You have to look. Otherwise, we're just going to continue with our habits and our patterns. Habits and patterns blind us to almost everything. And habits and patterns are easy because they're familiar and therefore they're pleasant. And we don't pay attention. So I invite you, take a look at your life.
This is very good advice. So I do, but I'll definitely have blind spots where there are some areas where it's just like a whole lot harder to do it in than others.
Well, yeah, and that's where the patience and the forgiveness arise. Just like with John's question about the electronics and computers and whatnot. There are each of us in terms of our social situation, our age, our gender, whatever it might be, we are going to have difficulties because of our karma. And that's just the way it goes. Each one of us have these hurdles or these learning experiences that are to be learned. And each of us, the tough ones are tough. The easy ones are easy. And if we want to really deepen our practice, we have to look at the more difficult ones.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you, Allan. We have 2 questions. Fred, you want to ask?
Yes, thank you. Oh, by the way, thanks, Allan, for the talk. As Avinash said, it's been really great so far. My question is, so most of the content I consume, content as in books or podcasts, relate to vipassana, more particularly Mahasi noting. But my practice is not noting right now. My practice is body scans.
Is what? I'm sorry?
Body scanning.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes I have trouble taking the insights from those podcasts, those books, and applying them to my practice. Even though they're both vipassana, I'm having trouble doing that. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about it.
These are techniques, and depending on how much you've been practicing and the development of your spiritual practice, your meditative practice, it's best to stick to one system until there is a significant baseline that you can rely on. And yeah, the body scanning and noting don't don't mesh very well. I don't to get into details. Which one is better, which one is worse is irrelevant. What is important is to stick to one and to remember as much as possible that any technique that we're using from the Theravadan perspective is using the examination of whatever it is, a sight, a sound, whatever it is, through the six sense doors, through the filter of either impermanence, suffering, or non-self. So long as we understand that whether it's noting or scanning, the purpose of that technique is to highlight and bring into the intuitive, non-thinking, but an intuitive way of being able to learn through the experience of impermanence, dissatisfaction or unsatisfactoriness, and non-self. But stick to one practice. Don't try to mix them. The lessons that are learned from either of the practices will, in certain contexts, will be the same. But stick to one practice until there's a maturity, and then you can then perhaps, depending on your teacher and depending on your opportunities, you can add new techniques.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Fred. All right, so let's try. Simon, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. I had a question. This has been less of a thing in recent past for me, but there have definitely been times in my practice where I've had a lot of lust is the word that's coming to mind around retreat practice itself. And maybe lust isn't the right word, but this kind of like craving to be on retreat more, or evaluating my life or the choices that I've made based on how much or little I'll be able to be on retreat. And it's been very painful. It's been helpful in the sense that it's gotten me to go on some longer retreats at times, but it's also been very painful and feels like it's not a mature view of daily life practice.
And your question in that
I guess
context.
the question is, how have you, I mean, you're, someone who's written a book for lay practitioners and have done a lot of retreat practice, but any advice that you have for working with ideas around retreat or the role of retreat given other life responsibilities, and the sort of, I don't know if you've had that kind of dukkha around it, but it can be quite intense at times for me.
Well, yeah, one of the ways to ameliorate a little bit of the issue is to begin to practice and to value the reflective practices and your daily life. To look at your daily life and begin to affect and alter changes so as the environment becomes increasingly more wholesome. The yearning that you're talking about deserves to be noted or to be observed. It's just simply a reaction to it's a complex psychological reaction to a wholesome notion. So, and rather than thinking about whether I'm on the Enneagram or my mother didn't do this or didn't do that, it's just a reaction. It's just a reaction. But there are ways you can incline your mind in wholesome ways that affect your daily life. And on the other hand, I'll use myself as an example. There was a time where I was living an unbalanced, hypocritical life, and I decided I had to change my livelihood. It took me 6 years before I was able to, get my degrees and yada, 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 and pass these exams and be able to leave where I was living. It took 6 years. But I inclined my mind slowly, and at the end of those 6 years, I was able to, in my case, it was nursing. I was able to begin to do nursing 8 months out of the year, and 4 months out of the year, I was able to then start doing practice, formal meditation retreat practice. So each of us will have different stories you may have kids, or whatever your situation is. There are ways in which you can consciously cultivate and sculpt your life so as that you will continue to support your inclination towards the holy life. And then, in 5 or 10 years, you might have the opportunity then to go off for 3 years. Patience and forgiveness and diligent, non-forgiving, not forgiving, diligent, non-flinching commitment towards the holy life is a very valuable inclination to keep in your mind.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Allan.
Thank you.
So I'm going to pull myself back up here so we could say goodbye. So we are right on time. We're right at the hour mark. Perfect. So Allan, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I got a ton out of it. I get the sense that a lot of people got a ton out of it. Allan, anything that you would like to say before we say goodnight?
Just to thank you and to support your work, John. What you're doing is very valuable, and also, I do want to also give us a quick short plug, and that is that at householdersvinaya.com there will soon be in January, I'm guessing. I'm going to try to create a hub where people can hook up for doing home retreats together. And if anybody has further questions about it, they can contact me with the information that you've provided this evening from householdersvinaya.com. So I look forward to making available similar work that you're doing, John, in creating community so that people can sit together and to up their practice, incline their minds towards a full understanding of the Noble Eightfold Path.
Well, I'll look forward to seeing how that develops, and I hope you'll please let me know how we at Sitheads can support that as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for being here, Allan. Thank you all, everyone who's here. Thank you for your time, for your attention, for your questions, for your practice. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.